Télécoms Sans Frontières is an international NGO. It's headquartered in Pau, in the south of France. It has deployment bases in Managua, Nicaragua, and in Asia, in Bangkok. And it grew out of the vision of our two founders, Jean-François Cazenave and Monique Lampetit, who had been doing more traditional international response during the Balkans Wars, the early part of the Balkans Wars. And when they went, they were bringing traditional commodities, so they were bringing clothing or bringing food. And what they recognized was that the refugees from that war were more interested in getting access to their satellite phone than they were even to the food or to the commodities. And so when they were displaced from their homes, the first thing they wanted to do was to make a phone call to their cousin in Germany or to their brother in London to let them know that they were alive, that other members of their family had died, what camp they were in, to reconnect with the rest of the world, because it's a terrible situation when you're disconnected completely. Also, families were split apart such that they wanted to reconnect with where their wife was, with the children, to let them know and reconnect. And so, growing out of that, they decided instead of having an NGO that would do traditional commodities for emergencies, that they would do telecommunications. And that's where TSF was born.
So can you tell me a little bit about the use of the organization in devices like VSATs for satellite internet?
So in an emergency, TSF TSF in general has three main jobs. So in an emergency, we try to establish telecommunications and internet services for first responders, so that the people that are from the government or from the UN, from international governments, police, anyone who's an emergency responder, doctors, have access to broadband internet as soon as they hit the ground for a disaster or for a conflict. Second, we provide free calling to the camps of displaced people. So we make a free 3-minute phone call for each family in the camps. And then third, in between emergencies, we train people on how to prepare for using technologies in a disaster. We work with local authorities on using technology for development programs, often health programs, and many other uses of ICTs outside of the emergency context or prepare for the emergency context. And when we do any of those three jobs, we have a suite of technologies that we can use. We don't have one that we prefer over the other. What we try to say is, in an emergency, each emergency is different. So you might arrive in one and the commercial network is down. You might arrive in a second and there never was a commercial network. And you might arrive in a third and the commercial network is up. And so you want to bring the technology that's appropriate for that context. So if there's a telecom system in the country that is down, which is increasingly the case, the GSM networks are often built but then overloaded or damaged in an emergency. And in those situations, we will come in for a short period of time from day one until the commercial network comes online and provide satellite service. Because the satellite, of course, is 22,500 miles in the sky, and so it's not damaged by an earthquake or by a conflict. And so we backhaul out using the satellites, and VSATs are one of our solutions, and BGANs, which are smaller satellite units, are another one of our solutions, all the way down to handheld units. We use the iSat Phone Pro often from Inmarsat for that purpose. And so when our first team comes in, they come in only with a small kit that they can bring on commercial air, and they'll have a couple BGANs and a couple iSat phones, maybe more than a couple iSat phones, a Wi-Fi router, a laptop, those types of things that we can carry with us. Then when we arrive, we will be able to use the VSATs that people have in place that weren't damaged, and we're trained on establishing the VSAT link and pointing the satellite dish. Or as the VSATs do arrive from elsewhere, we then transition from a handset like a BGAN or like a iSat phone up to a BGAN, and then up again to a VSAT, and then from the VSAT back to the commercial network.
And how does it work in case where the commercial network is blocked in countries like Syria where you're involved, or in Mali where there are conflict areas and you need to give a hand telecom-wise where you can't build any kind of existing infrastructure.
Right. Well, it really depends on the local situation, and we have to work within the regulatory system that we find. In some places, you're allowed to use satellite systems. Sometimes you're allowed to use a satellite system that's a handheld satellite phone and or a BGAN, but VSATs are restricted. And other times they're all restricted, and then we have to use a landline network where we can, or engage in networking activities rather than the satellite backhaul. If we're in a situation where we're not allowed to use the satellite network for some reason, we try to comply with that. In other situations where it's unstable and where there's not really a rule on what it is, then we try to work with the local folks that understand what the situation is and try to find the technology that's most appropriate.
So do you meet a lot of local governments' resistance?
It's usually not. We are an independent organization. We don't take a side on any of these issues. And so we typically don't run into government opposition. But if a government tells us that we have to stop, then we stop.
Even in conflict areas?
If a government comes and tells us that we have to stop, we don't have a choice.
Mm-hmm. And the satellite you use are usually commercial satellites that aren't owned by any sort of nation?
No, I mean they're owned by, they're commercial, yes. So we will use commercial off-the-shelf satellite equipment for our work, and most of these are licensed worldwide. VSATs can be more challenging in some situations because importing a VSAT into a country can be difficult. In those situations, we can use partner with a local organization that has a VSAT license, and then we can use their VSAT. Or typically we're not the one transmitting, and so they may have a VSAT, but it might be damaged, or they might need assistance in pointing the VSAT, and our technical people will assist that local NGO or the local government or the UN agency, whoever it might be, to get the VSAT that's already in the country properly working or networked with the rest of the system.
Mm-hmm. So could you tell me a little bit about the specific cases, about some stories from the field, about your recent involvements or project, or some interesting interactions you had with VSATs?
Well, let's see. Everybody always uses Haiti as the example because it was so big, so I'll use Haiti as an example. In Haiti, and it's not always, Haiti's not typical in a lot of ways because it was giant. But in Haiti, we came in within 24 hours, and our first team there brought in the handheld satellite equipment and the BGANs. The first thing we did was we used BGANs to set up a link for the airport and for the president of Haiti and for the police and for the UN. The UN agencies have their own very good ICT teams, but different agencies have different teams often, and so they'll ask us to help them. We have very good relationships with UNICEF and OCHA and the World Food Program. So we will work with them to set up links within the MINUSTA in Haiti so that there were facilities available for UN people, but then also for these local governments. Then once we were there and we got access to VSAT equipment, some VSATs were brought in by UNICEF, some VSATs were made available through government agencies. We then would set up the VSAT and take ourselves off of the BGAN and onto the VSAT, so we could serve more people at a more cost-effective basis. The advantage of the BGAN is that it's so portable and so easy, and we can bring it anywhere. But then the price per bit is higher often than the VSAT. And so if we can get a VSAT established, then we can bring the price down further. Once we had the VSATs established, we would move to a commercial system when it came back online. So there was a commercial wireless broadband system that was local in Port-au-Prince, and that came on, I think, in the third week, and then we transferred off of VSATs and onto that commercial network because it would then use undersea cables, which were cheaper still. In other situations, we'll come in and use the BGANs for much longer if there's no access, if it's in a very remote area and there's no access to VSAT equipment. And then we'll stay until someone arrives to the VSAT and then transfer it there. In other situations, VSATs, Ethiopia is a very difficult country for VSATs, and it's very difficult to get a license, even in emergency, in Ethiopia for a VSAT. And so in those situations, maybe people will use the BGANs more, or they will work with a local NGO that has their own, or with the government that has their own license.
I don't know if you have data about it, but do you know how common the use of these devices in a non-licensed way?
Unlicensed?
Yeah.
Illegal, you mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. We don't have data, certainly, for that. It's hard to know. VSATs maybe less because they're big. You know, they're probably people who bring in and used equipment illegally. But it's, you know, in a big place of city, the VSATs are large. And so, and certain governments, you know, and they also have to be brought into the country. And if someone brings a big dish into the country, it's hard for customs not to see it. And so my expectation is that it's difficult to do that in many of these places.
Or in conflict zones?
In conflict zones, maybe. But again, the VSAT has such a big profile and such a signature that it would be harder in those situations to hide a VSAT. I think, you know, and with commercial networks, if you're really acting surreptitiously, my guess is that people are using GSM networks from across borders and things like that, rather than VSATs. But it's possible. We try not to, because we have to work with governments over and over again, and so we try to respect the law, and we try to make sure that we're not denied entry to countries because of this.
Could you tell me a little bit about projects that their purpose is economic developments using those devices?
So we don't do as much formal economic development work, although what we do is set up internet centers in places where there's no connectivity whatsoever. This is funded, we have several centers in Africa that are funded from something called the IT Cup, which is a football tournament in Europe where all the technology companies send their own companies' teams to play together in France. And the money for that is used to fund TSF centers in Africa. And so we'll then use VSATs, and often in those situations, or if we can, we'll use a commercial network if we can get a DS1 line or something out to a remote area. Often it's impossible, sometimes it's possible. But we'll go assess the situation, choose the right technology for that job, and then set up a center. We then don't engage in the economic activity ourselves. We try to be dumb pipe and set up a link for others to use it. More frequent probably is our work in healthcare. And so we work on the border between Myanmar and Thailand with the Oxford University Health System and with a local medical school in Thailand. And there are a string of health centers along the border that serve people who have come over from Myanmar. Often people come through with malaria because of the journey. And this is most dangerous for pregnant women who have malaria. And so they've set up these health centers to help people, but they didn't have an IT system that was able to record all the patient information, and they didn't have a telecom system that was able to share it. And so we assisted them in that project. Similarly, in Managua, we have a partnership with the health department of Managua. They have a big dengue fever problem in Managua, and we helped them with an SMS system to make sure that the people that were either gathering information about dengue or that were doing spraying for dengue were coordinated using IT tools. And so we set up that system with them, and we continue to work with them on that project. We have a base in Managua that allows us to do that.
Now, do you also use radio technologies, or is satellite now the most common, or maybe only?
We will use radio when they're available by others. The UN has a more thorough radio system. The World Food Program has what they call security communications, which are typically mean terrestrial radio communications. Those systems require a mast that's too big for us to carry in on our emergency response teams. We really see ourselves as being rapid response, and so we get in as soon as possible with the lightest possible equipment, and then often after 30 days we're gone. And so the UN, with ships and things that are much bigger, dedicated aircraft, will bring in things that will allow for radio systems in a way that we typically don't. We also don't have teams that are widely distributed over many miles, such that we have to communicate between the teams in the way that a food distribution service might have to. We set up individual centers that are backhauled out using satellite, and so people come to us. Or we will go to camps and have our teams go out to camps and set up centers on a daily basis at the different camps. And most recently, what we've started doing is we'll use these GSM systems in a box. We worked with Vodafone on a system called the Instant Network. And what that is it's 3 Pelican cases, each of which can fit in a commercial airline. So we'll send 3 people with 3 Pelican cases, and that allows us to set up a temporary GSM network. It has its own mast, and we can do a third of a mile or so system, and allows people to use their own phones to communicate back out in an emergency. We then use a VSAT to backhaul that out. So all the information comes in from individual phones in a camp, let's say, to our mast that we set up. That then is hooked up to a VSAT, and the VSAT takes all of that and pipes it back out to a base station someplace else through the satellite. Often the base station will be a Vodafone base station in Spain, but the connection will be via VSAT.
So what would you say is the prominent disadvantage of using VSAT?
The disadvantage, it's all a balance, right? It's a great tool for certain jobs and not as good for others. It's big, and so it's hard to carry with you. You can't bring it on a commercial plane. There are more restrictions on VSATs from a regulatory point of view than there are on other things, and it is relatively expensive compared with terrestrial systems. So it's less expensive than a handset per minute and allows greater throughput than a handset in terms of data connectivity. But it's more expensive than if you were going to do it using a landline or using a commercial wireless broadband, widely distributed broadband system. It also requires more training to set it up and maintain it. So you really need to know what you're doing to set up a VSAT. It's very easy to set up a BGAN. And so there's a cost and benefit there in terms of training. When we do our training for people, we teach everybody how to do a BGAN, and at the end of the training, everybody can do a BGAN. To train on a VSAT really takes a week of just VSAT training and practice. And so that takes a little more time. But once you've got a VSAT, then you can do a lot more. So it's pros and cons.
And what's the cost of using it?
Of using the VSAT? Well, it depends on what your deal is. They have all different pricing systems. You can buy a bunch of minutes that you then have use of anywhere in the world throughout their coverage area, or you can buy it on a spot basis. On a spot basis, it's more expensive, but then maybe you don't waste minutes if you don't use them. We tend to buy all our minutes for the BGANs on an annual basis to drive our cost down there. We don't do so on a VSAT generally, although we do have some of our own VSATs, and so in some situations we'll do that over long periods of time. And the more you buy, the marginal cost of each additional minute is less, or bit is less, but it's still expensive.
Mm-hmm. So what, according to what you see on field, what is the next step of satellite connectivity? What is the next trend or the next technology that you see that is already in develop or already exists that can furthermore change your work or similar work or the influence of these devices in disaster areas?
I think there are a couple things. Here, let me. You just have to let it go. I can't do it for both. So,
Just a second, I'll just...
yeah.
Okay.
So I think there are a few trends. One is attaching GSM systems to satellite for backhaul. I think more and more people, when we encounter them in the field, have their own devices. This wasn't the case 15 years ago, but now, even among least developed countries, you see, and even among refugee populations, a huge percentage are coming with their own phones. And so in the past, we would have to bring everything. But now if they've got their own phones, whether they're using GSM or they're using Wi-Fi over those phones, they've got a piece of equipment, and they're going to want to use their own piece of equipment, and we want them to use their own piece of equipment. And so making sure they can do that, I think, is going to be an important thing over the next several years. That's going to mean having GSM and Wi-Fi available on a distributed basis. So that last mile, really that last quarter mile, you know, the little bubble that we build around, we're going to have to be flexible on how we do that. And then I also see in VSATs, the VSAT technology is getting better. And so you see smaller dishes, you see self-pointing dishes, you see dishes that are easier to operate. Some of the self-pointing dishes are really expensive, and they're mechanized in ways that make it difficult in a off-grid energy situation, or in a harsh environment they might be harder. So we still point our own. We use manual ones rather than the automated ones. But nonetheless, the VSAT technology continues to get better and better, and so that'll be really good. I also think that the spectrum that we use will change. Increasingly, we're starting to see, well, Wi-Fi, unlicensed spectrum, it's now in every device, and it's interoperable, so you don't have to worry what air interface you're using, you don't have to worry what device it is, whether it's a laptop or a phone. Even an inexpensive phone typically has Wi-Fi, and you can do more over the Wi-Fi than you could before. Sometimes it was restricted, so you could only do internet browsing over the Wi-Fi, but now it's integrated with messaging so seamlessly, and even with voice so seamlessly, that I think Wi-Fi will grow in importance. And the spectrum that we're using might change too. There are more bands that are coming online, and more lower frequency bands. And as we get lower frequency bands, that makes our job easier, because all things being equal, a lower frequency band allows us to distribute a signal at a greater distance, and a signal that doesn't attenuate as easily through barriers. And so we can go inside houses, or we can operate inside someplace and have it go through a wall, which in a security situation is very useful. Or we can just go farther using a 600 or 700 megahertz signal versus a 5 gigahertz signal. We can do a lot. You can't reuse the frequency as easily because of self-interference. But in an emergency, when you don't have lots and lots of radios, that's not as big a deal. And so I think those are some of the trends we see.
So is the existing satellite system is sufficient to support all that, or are we going to see more satellites launch? And
that I don't know. I mean, I see satellites, announcements of new satellites going up, both new satellites to increase capacity, but also new satellites with larger antenna so that you can have smaller Earth stations, and satellites that are geared more towards data than towards voice. I certainly see all that happening. I don't have a good enough insight to know how many more we're going to see or what they're going to look like. But I think, usage continues to drive up. And so whether that's in the emergency space or that's in the extractive industries or maritime or aviation, you see a lot of use. But I think the cost just has to come down for that for it to continue to grow.
Is there anything else you would like to say that you think is important for this matter?
No, I don't think so. I think just that in emergencies, there was a time when access to ICT tools was a luxury in emergencies, where people didn't understand why we needed to bring a team in to reestablish ICTs, as opposed to saying we need to bring in food or clothing or medical supplies. That era is gone. Now ICTs are as critical as any of these other things because they're an integral component to the delivery of all these things. The systems that we have set up to deliver food or security or shelter are all dependent on a level of coordination and access to data that means that you have to have connectivity at all times. And so the more rapidly you can establish connectivity, the more reliable you can make it, and the lower the cost you can achieve, you're really going to save more lives. It's not a luxury anymore, it's a necessity.